Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks Ty for organizing this session. We have with us today Lavindra Silva and Avish Sood, partner 100 Watts. 100 Watts is an accelerator platform for retail technology startups, where we are nurturing a lot of innovation on retail technology to help take them to the industry and also handhold them for whatever basic needs are to scale up the business and to take them to the next level. Today is the seventh session in this series of product marketing we're hosting, and we are pleased to have both these eminent speakers. Over to you, Bhavish,
Thank
for
you,
this.
Ajay. Good evening, everyone. Lavindra, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure, Bhavish.
Yes. So for those of you who don't know, an interesting tidbit from on the personal side of Lavindra. Lavindra is a Sri Lankan living in India. Um, has an interesting story. He's married to a Sadhani, also a very dear friend of mine. Interesting story. They met at a computer class when his wife's father was India's ambassador to Sri Lanka. Truly a cross-border deal. Uh, um, and I sometimes jokingly tell him that I exchanged India and Sri Lanka exchanged, between me and Lavi. I lived in Sri Lanka for a year, and Lavi is now living in India. So Lavindra, always a pleasure to have you here. We'll address you as Lavi. Slightly more easier to remember. So Lavi, why don't you give us a little bit of your life history? Living from Sri Lanka, then making 30-40 hour journeys to the US where you did your undergrad.
Yeah, so I mean, I come, I guess, from a little bit of an unconventional background into the sales role. I lived in the US for over 20 years, and I started actually in the services area, right? So I was head of services for a couple of companies. So I was on the implementation side, as I say, the tail end of the dog, right? So the sales person would sell the product or service or whatever they were doing, and then essentially it would get dumped on my lap and my team's lap to take it to fruition. And so that's sort of where I cut my teeth. I was enamored with technology early enough. I started, I guess, in computer science, but I actually felt that sitting hours behind a computer was not my future. I wanted to actually interface with people, and so I carved out this role for myself where I was always the intermediary, the bridge between the technical people and the customer. So that was sort of the role that I naturally sort of fell into over time, and it seems sort of a not too far of a stretch at that point after seeing so many sort of, and I'm happy to share some of those stories of implementations that were badly scoped or badly sold, that I figured, and I've been on innumerable sales calls as the implementation person that they would tag along as a sort of a quasi sales engineer. And eventually I told myself, hey, how come the sales guys are making all the big bucks? Maybe I should, because it seems like they're buying because I do a good job of convincing them that they should buy. So I moved into that role, early in my career. And I think, I appreciate the background or the exposure that I had in understanding how hard it is to actually put in technology solutions, and the empathy and the communication skills I built speaking to customers in implementation helped me tremendously on the sales side.
Okay, so let me ask you, Lavindra, a few controversial questions. Okay,
sure. Love those.
One of my favorite disdains with some of my previous employers has always been that the sales guys have always been overcompensated, right? And whichever bosses I have spoken to, they've said, "Hey, sales is very critical. It's probably the most critical department. This is what who pays for your salary." But over a period of time, you and I have debated this question, and we seem to have a fairly reasonable understanding that sales guys should not have a variable. They should not be paid large commission-based structures, right? Yeah. Which is predominantly the case right now. Yeah. What are some of your thoughts on that?
I think, when you set up a compensation system that's dramatically and significantly different from the rest of the organization, and one that sort of has such a high variable component in most cases even, right. I think it changes the dynamic between those team and the rest of the company. For example, I think a lot of people perceive them as sort of not not incorrectly, that they're sort of independent agents, right? I mean, they're sort of coin operated independent agents, and hey, if they don't sell here today, they'll be gone tomorrow, and so there are these sort of very bad sort of habits, behaviors, mindsets that get created that I think really get in the way of selling. And I think too much of today's sales playbooks are based in the 20th century and not the 21st century, right? So unlike other areas of a business, I mean, I think if you take marketing today, if you don't know anything about digital marketing and all the tools and technologies that are available, I mean, you'll never get a job, and no one will hire you, right?
Sure.
And I think there's enough out there for even CEOs who are doing the hiring or to understand, is this person competent? I mean, are they even talking the same language? Unfortunately, on the sales side, you don't see that. I think you still have these, I think practices from a bygone era still applying. And I think that is the fundamental problem. And I think there's a couple of, I mean, I'm not trying to justify the sales profession in some sense, but there are a lot of reasons for this. For example, I don't know how many South Asian parents get up and, tell their kids, I want you to be a salesperson, son or daughter, right? That never happens, right? I want you to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. And so, or even at the very least, okay, or you became a marketing person, okay. Right? But never a salesperson. There is this stigma that somehow it is sort of a profession beneath someone.
Right.
And
it's a low intellect job.
Yeah, like if you can't succeed anywhere else, then you should succeed in sales, because that's like the last bastion of the incompetent, it seems, right? And by the way, that bias exists even in the US, and I think partly it is the fact that you today you can get professional degrees if you're an accountant or a lawyer or even a marketer, right? The Chartered Institute of Marketing, but there is no professional body that gives a sales accreditation at all, right? I mean, various courses and all that, but there's no sort of known university. You don't go to university and sign up for a degree in sales, for example. Right. I mean, there's no such thing, right? So I think a lot of what we have in terms of people that get into sales either get into it for the wrong reasons, maybe because they have the allure of quick money, or the fact that they can sort of cowboy themselves in and cowgirl themselves in for a few months or a year, and then sort of move on to the next. I think those have led to all kinds of practices. So on the compensation question, I do tend to agree that, and I have concrete example. I mean, when I built WSO2, it had a strict policy of it was not a head of a global sales there. It was strict policy. Everybody gets compensated the same way. It's a bonus pool. Salespeople don't need to be recognized as somehow different, right? I mean, you don't charge a QA person by the number of bugs they discover, right? I mean, you don't compensate in that way. So why would you do that to a salesperson, right? And today selling is a sport. So why would you pick one person?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Lavi. And I've worked with two organizations where the sales guys were almost like demigods, right? And I saw the rift. Actually, the product managers would actually sign the deals so that the sales guys would not make compensation, right? I mean, it creates all sorts of cultural issues. Right. Those guys, the sales guys would have fancy cars, they'll have fancy houses, and it actually became a jealousy factor for a lot of the people. They said, "I'm the product, I'm doing the hard work," and So if you were to write a new playbook for 21st century, okay, and I think there are two parts to it: pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? Right. So how would you write it? What are some of the attributes of the people you will look for? You had 2 or 3 sales roles, right? But you never were trained to be a sales guy, right? I mean, it was not like a first career choice. You were a management consultant.
No, I mean, thing is, so I think I've always been selling. It's a matter of, actually having an official role and a responsibility to actually carry your revenue. I mean, that I've had multiple roles in terms of selling. But one of the things I think that, if you were talking about a post-COVID playbook, right? I think, we talk a lot about this word customer experience, right? I think everybody sort of know this, you must make sure you have a great customer experience. One of the things that it should be part of that experience is people think that customer experience starts at the process where you've completed a purchase or just before you make a purchase. So what it actually means is, actually in my book, I would expand it a bit and say it's a sales experience as well, right? So you have to build in, whether you're a SaaS software company or the enterprise sales software company, you got to make sure when a customer does finally interface with you, either through a website or get in touch with a salesperson, that is a seamless, well-oiled machine that takes care of the customer. and it should be very high touch, very high class, sensitive, customized to the particular person. You can't treat all the customers the exact same way. I think people, so today in the post-pandemic or pandemic world, what you want to focus on is really taking the time to respond to customers as if they're like, a little bit of diamonds that suddenly show up, right? Because there is going to be clearly less economic activity in the world. So when they do contact you, right, treat them like, they are honored guests as opposed to, hey, let me push something to them, right? I mean, let me start my spiel from day one. Understand where they're coming from, really get to know your customer and what their concerns are. So I think it's better to be a good listener than a smooth talking salesperson.
Right.
And I think when I built sales teams, I really focused on that. It's no longer this sort of used car salesman, pushy, aggressive, mostly male. Sort of, I'm sorry to say that, but that's true. Approach where you sort of badger somebody into buying. I mean, think about it. The last time you bought something, I'm sure when you decide to buy a purchase, you've done your research, you've gone into the web, you're pretty savvy about what's available in the market, right? And you've sort of 70-80% there as to maybe I have two options I'm sort of weighing in my mind, and then I've done a fair amount of research. In fact, I would hazard to say that you probably know more than the salesperson you're going to talk to, which is an unfortunate situation. But yeah, you have got all this information in front of you. So what you want now is somebody to help you sort of maybe share some information that you may have not found on the web, that you didn't know about the product or the service, and facilitate that buying process, right? It's very different from selling, right? When you're facilitating buying, right? You're enabling somebody to make a purchase decision. You are not convincing them, right? So it's not this way, it's more that way, right? And I think that's really key. I mean, you need to sort of listen a lot more, understand where they're coming from, what is the problem they're trying to solve. And these things, there are no really shortcuts to. I mean, a salesperson today has to be as good a researcher as a marketer or a CFO. There are no shortcuts to that, right? So you're going to talk to a customer, you better know everything that's available in the public domain. You will better know everything to know about the industry they're in, the kind of pressures that they're facing, all of that stuff. I mean, before you pick up the phone and respond to a call or make a call. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. So Lavi, you brought out an interesting point that they have to be facilitators, right?
Yes.
I think a lot of sales guys I'm seeing that change in behavior because customers don't want talk to a sales guys, right? So a lot of companies started writing titles like strategy or business development or client executives, because the moment you saw sales, clients wanted to just run away, right? I mean,
right.
A classic Glenn Ross or a used car salesman, right? Yes. Now, there is a behavior change which is happening, but the companies are still compensating on the old style.
Correct. So you can't put a veneer, right? It has to be, and I think that's a key point. I a very, very good astute observation on your part, Bhavish. I think it's true that this is why many sort of companies that sort of sometimes come to help ask me for advice, say, hey, how can I fix my sales engine? How can I build a scalable sales engine? And I think many people are sort of the sort of mistaken notion that a single person, a rock star salesman, can walk in and sort of make all their troubles go away. If they took 6 years to get there, they expect to get out of it in 6 months. It ain't going to happen, right? And I think fundamentally what you need to look at is, are you a buyer facilitation organization, right? I mean, what is your ethos, right? What is your culture? What is your mindset towards customers? And then that has to translate into the processes and systems you have behind, right? So you can create a fancy looking face up front, but if you don't have the right compensation systems, the incentives, and the metrics and KPIs and measures to encourage that behavior, then you're not going to have that fundamental change. And I think that really goes back to actually hiring of the right people, right? So, I've had many people that I've interviewed that, talk themselves right out of a job because they haven't let me even ask them a question. I mean, they're on a spiel right from the time they walk in the door. And I say, oh, wow, this will be the same behavior they'll exhibit on a customer call or a customer meeting.
Yeah. So on that note, to segue into two questions. How do you hire a sales guy? I've seen several sales resumes, always about how much I achieved the last quota, which I was carrying, right? I mean, I've done 120% year on year. and I was President's Club or I was Winners Club, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these things, in my observation, are not exactly demonstrable in a new company.
Correct.
So what traits do you look for, both at a junior as well as a senior level, you know?
Yeah. So let me just, let me use a sort of maybe example from my own, work experience. So when I built the sales team at WSO2, and when I came on board, they were at $500,000. I think today they're at $50 million. Open source middleware software company, and all our customers. At that time we were targeting a global customer base, selling from Sri Lanka, and we very early created a profile of what we consider to be the ideal salesperson, right? And then between the CEO and my sort of deputy person, Devaka, and myself, we kept the three of us honest on making sure there was no sort of personal bias involved, on making sure that every candidate that we hired fit that profile. Not necessarily was that profile about quota, and all these other things, that the metrics that companies normally look for, right? So we look for a lot of intangibles in that, and that, by the way, that sales person profile is what they follow to this day. So they've now scaled from, when we started, it was a handful of people. I built up the team for about 10, 15 salespeople, and I think they're probably at 50 people now or more now globally. And they still follow that same sort of profile of that fits their culture, their ethos, the way they want to project themselves to the world. And what we found was, so look at the challenge that we had, was that we had very, very complicated software. I consider myself a software guy, but middleware is like, it's a whole other ball game. It's a level of technical difficulty that is several leagues above the normal. So I, one choice is, how do we sell that, right? The question is, there's a very technical product, and we're selling to CTOs and architects, companies like eBay and Mercedes-Benz and all these companies, right? How do you sell that with limited sales resources, right? Because you couldn't find somebody at that architect level to be the salesperson. So we just broke that model down and said, it's not about finding a technical person. Let's find someone who can build relationships with those architects and CTOs. And then at the appropriate juncture in the sales process, we will bring the architect and the high-powered tech person to the call. We did a couple of things. We even trained those tech people to sort of talk to customers properly, right? I'll give you an example of that. I would have somebody on the other side from eBay and the CTO or somebody, and they will go on and say, I've done this, I've done that, I've got many patents to my name, I'm a blah, 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 right? And very, very impressive credentialing. So they would do this as an introduction. Now I would tell my person, I would say, okay, Prabhat, go ahead and introduce yourself. And he would give me sort of a rank and serial number. I'm so-and-so, I've been at the company 2 years and my title is X. And I'm looking at him going, hey, give me a little bit more. This guy just, made him sound like he was the next thing, next to sliced bread. So I had to actually train people, and it's sort of a South Asian thing that we don't really talk about ourselves that effusively, right? So we had to actually do some training to get them to actually introduce themselves properly, in a sort of a mirror, not to like bloat themselves up, but actually, they were highly qualified people. They've done equally impressive things. They just needed to state that in the interview. In the introduction. So we sort of worked on that profile of finding people that could communicate and build relationships easily. So in the case of WSO2, in Sri Lanka, given the labor pool, we went and looked for people who worked in the garment industry, in the buying offices, who'd been, we went to the hospitality industry. Now, this is the furthest from tech you could come, right? So we got people from different industries, but that had a really high touch approach and was comfortable engaging in conversation and building relationships. And then we sort of had this two-tier approach of having somebody technical brought into the right process. So we built that whole sales engine that way, so it scaled.
Right. So, in the startups, one of the things, and you've been a VC, you were a partner at my previous fund.
Yep.
You and I grappled, or I think a lot of VCs grapple, we meet so many technically competent or domain-centric founders, but with no inability to do sales. Should they really be an entrepreneur or no? My answer to it. You and I laughed over it. Yeah.
So look, I can only say this. And I can say, look, you want to really run a company, you better learn. I'm old school there. You better learn everything there is to do. Learn the finance, learn the HR, learn the marketing, learn the sales. And if you have technical, then that's fine. You covered one. but there are so many bases you need to kind of come up to speed, because you can't say, oh, I'm a technical person, I'm sorry, I'm not selling. I think that just doesn't work. I mean, from my personal example, every company, whether it was WSO2 with a very highly technical product, every company that I headed up sales or built a sales team for, I made sure to take the time to learn the technology intimately. I drove those engineers nuts because I asked a whole lot of dumb questions, right? And I did my own study because I felt uncomfortable, representing a company where I didn't feel I knew the technology.
Right.
Now, I think the technical person needs to do the same thing. If you're a tech founder, you need to understand how the sales process works. Look, your company's future survival is based on revenue, incoming revenue. If you don't have a grasp of that, then you have no place being in the business, frankly, right? Or find yourself a co-founder, that can do that. But saying that, well, I'll just build it and they'll come, I think is asking for trouble.
Right. So, Lavi, what about? So we talked about compensation. We talked about behavioral traits.
Mm-hmm.
You now run a very interesting vegan food company. You've left tech. Is there any change you're perceiving in the older tech side? In terms of how the sales functions are changing. You look at public companies. You and I both work for public companies. Instead of all the things we want to talk about, consultative selling and the whole managing the whole process, being nice to the clients and not pushy.
Right.
Do you really see a change actually happening?
No, unfortunately not. And I think if you look at the data, it will tell you that most salespeople seem to be leaving at about 18 months.
Right.
Which means they're hitting some kind of
not even leaving. They're managed out because they're not
exactly. They're hitting some wall, right? I mean, they've been set some target and they just can't hit it. So in 18 months, they're gone. If that's happening in your organization, you really seriously need to look, I think, at, and I think you really need to look at this whole concept of selling. So I think, sort of divesting marketing from selling is a first problem. I think they're all combined, right? So I used to have my marketing and sales team sit in the same room, right? And I hate the designation, right? Call it marketing if you want, right? Sales and marketing. But essentially, you can't really divorce the two functions. And I think, you've been at Gartner, there are plenty of Gartner studies, Forrester studies that say, people today, the sales process, 80% of the sales process already happened before they contact you. So what you put out in terms of marketing content and information about you and the product is key now. I mean, so it has to be tied into a sort of a selling process there, right? So sales has been involved in that outbound messaging as much as what happens once that messaging is successful and somebody contacts you. And marketing still continues to be involved because you have to now feed sort of back, information that is critical to the sales process, and you need marketing's help to do that properly. So it's a very sort of integrated function. So I think, if you start sort of, embracing these salespeople and hiring people with the right mindset, and I think this is not naively a simple task. I think it's a lot of work, but if you do that correctly, then you can sort of get yourself going. I think one of the early things that I think marketing, I think there's a lot of interest now in this concept called category, being a category leader, category marketing, right? And the first part of that first leg of those three-legged stool there is content design. So I think without using too much terminology, content design is simply sort of understanding what you want to be in the segment that you want to operate. You used to call it product market fit / plus positioning, right? If you call it that, that's fine. But you got to figure out what is it that you want to do, who is the customer you want to target, and how are you positioning yourself in the market.
Sure.
And then
like an ideal profile. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And then have the whole sales team, and I mean the whole sales team means the CEO, the engineers, they all have to have a sales mindset, right? You can't be in a situation where a salesperson works really, really hard to get a meeting and a demonstration, and the engineer comes in completely unprepared, done no research, and just spouts off something that is just generic in nature. That's the end of that sale, right? So everybody sort of have this mindset. And I remember WSO2, because of the time difference, our customers are always in the East Coast or West Coast of the US mostly. And at 2:00 in the morning, we would have sales calls. I don't recall a single instance in the 3.5 years I worked there where any one single engineer or architect, however senior they were, would say, no, I can't join a call. In fact, every time I asked, without hesitation, they would say, yeah, no problem. What do I need to do? Please brief me, blah, 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 blah. And never was a no. It didn't matter.
Yeah, but if you drove a Ferrari and you were getting compensated on a variable pay, they would probably have not done that, right?
No, exactly, right? Because they all knew we were all getting, the bonuses are based on how the whole company grew, not how I grew, right? So everybody was like, hey, I also want a part of the action. And it's a team sale. I mean, today, it's not like a vacuum, the whole, the old American commercial about, somebody knocks on your door, sells you this vacuum cleaner by, putting dirt on your carpet. And if you buy it, the housewife, then at that time, housewives, you get the vacuum cleaner. That was a complete sale done by one person. Today, sales is, it's a team sport. There's so many people involved in somebody's purchasing decision and closing that. I mean, why should one group or one team member get compensated more than everybody else in that process? I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, I think the culture is not going to be pretty easy to change, and that it turns out it's a pretty big lacuna. So I'm going to, there's a similar question from Soumya in our audience. She herself comes from a sales role, and she's kind of complaining that the sales guys are expected to be 25 hours. It's not even 24 hours. 25 hours into 8 days. Work pressure. Then then if not for a parity in pay, how do you get reimbursed at all, right? What would a sales compensation plan look like? Because we get asked that question everywhere, right? I mean, in the current companies, in the startups, in the larger companies who are public, this is, I think, problem number one after the positioning side, which you kind of referred to.
Yeah. So the question from Soumya is that because of the hours that they work, should they get paid more, essentially, right?
Or maybe that how do you build parity in the pay, right? How do you get reimbursed at all? Like, how do you compensate a salesperson, right? I mean, if you look at a call center guy, get compensated on the number of calls, right? Or an Uber driver can get compensated on the number of rides he does.
Right.
So how do you compensate a salesperson?
So I think you could compensate a certain percentage of variable on activity, right? Positive activity, in response and all that, response time. And you can measure all of that very easily now, whether you responded to email on time. But I wouldn't put a huge premium on that variable there. I would really focus on, so what I did, I mean, to give you an example, we had an offsite, we have at WSO, we used to have an offsite every January. Everybody flew in from all over the offices in the world. And, the senior level staff, we went into, and this was about over 100 people at that time. We would go into a sort of an all-day seclusion for 2-3 days. And in the evenings, obviously, everybody would relax because we were strategizing, and this was engineering and sales and marketing, everybody. So in the evenings, people would relax, would have dinner, drinks, whatever. And we usually at a resort. And I remember once the CEO, Sanjeev, said, hey, Lavi, hey, how come your team's working? Did you get them to work? I said, no, I didn't get them to work. Why? Let me see. So they're all gone, after dinner. The rest of the people are still at the bar and, doing a little dancing and music and all that. My team had got into their pajamas, come out into the sort of a lounge area, and they were all making calls. See, because, that was a time that customers, and I hadn't said anything. No one had, said that they had to do that. In fact, they were all supposed to be off. But they felt that it was their, responsibility because they had a number, right? So I think the motivations are different. I mean, if somebody is working really that hard, I mean, not that I didn't check everybody else's individual contribution. So at the end of the day, we had a regular performance appraisal system that, an engineer would have. So if somebody was a star and you clearly knew who they were, then you would give them a bigger bonus than if somebody was not. So this parity question on compensation sort of goes away if you just think all of the resources the same way. So if you use the metric in sales, we use a different set of metrics. In engineering, use a different set of metrics. So the metrics may differ, but the way we compensate is the same. So if somebody's a rock star, they get a rock star bonus. If somebody is average, then they get average, and then and told like how do we make them exceptional, because we want exceptional in all ranks. So that's what we do. But I don't think that we have to, sort of give people extra because they did something in particular, right? So if they achieve certain targets, whatever they may be as a group, we would compensate them. One of the things that we saw that happened very well is when we had to onboard a new salesperson, because it was sort of a team, just like you would have seen engineering, the other salespeople would get together and help that person through, because it was a whole team effort that was getting rewarded, right? So you didn't want to lag it. At the same time, if that person was not working out, they were gone. They would come back and, tell me, hey, look, we've been trying, we've done everything to get this person up to speed. It's not working. They're not a fit. And out they would go. So that ethos was even in engineering. They did the same thing in engineering. We did the same thing in sales.
Right. So it comes down to culture then, it's all about, if you move away from the glory, glory-based metrics models, then, obviously.
Right.
Yeah. No, kind of changing tracks. What about consultative selling? Are you a big believer in those frameworks? I know companies have built multi-million-dollar businesses. We used to use a Gartner. I'm sure I've looked at methodologies. You and I built one when we were at Point 54. Talked about ideal customer profile, positioning. Do you think?
So, I mean, it is better than some of the stuff that's out there. But I think I've been in the last year. I've been looking at various. I'm always researching to see whether there is anything else that's better out there. And it's remarkable. I looked at the top 100 or 50, whatever, LinkedIn sales professionals in the world. And I've been sort of going through and looking at some of the content that they're generating. And I am still shocked that I still see stuff that's a 20th century playbook.
Mm-hmm.
So there's only a handful, I think, of people and that I would say are working out of a 21st century playbook, right? And that I think it has a lot to do with what you and I have been discussing today is that there is still a very entrenched mindset that sales somehow is a very different sort of entity. And they should be treated differently. They should be structured differently. Autonomous
people who bring in revenue have to be treated differently, right? Yeah, or overcompensated, like I used to call it. Yeah.
I mean, compensate them. I mean, I'm not saying don't compensate them, but there has to be some parity. It can't be crazy. They can't be driving a Ferrari while everybody comes in a Maruti. Work.
The accountant is as important as the sales guy because he's running your invoices, he's paying your payables. So
I think that what CEOs are missing is the focus. So if you're building a outside looking in company, instead, you're putting the customer sort of in the center of all of this, right? Then you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is that way. So essentially, if you sort of create this, you're focusing on the customer. Well, the customer is not going to want to have, the invoices generated late, having shoddy customer service, poor technical support, right? Crappy code, bugs, not on time service delivery. They need all of that to work too, right? And the salesperson does too, because that is how they sell. It's a lot of referral business.
Yeah, you won't be successful without any of this. Yes.
Yeah. So how do you do that? I mean, you had to get everybody on the same page, performing at the same level to be successful.
Right.
You can't have one part of the organization firing on 12 cylinders and the rest on 6.
Yeah.
The car's not going to go anywhere.
I've been in a situation where people at the same level were 30x apart in finance compared to sales. 30x apart, same band.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right? You can't defend that. I mean, in reality today, you cannot defend that, right? You can't defend that kind of compensation.
Right. So, question from Ajay, who's the managing partner at 100 Watts. Very interesting question. What are the factors for a startup to focus on, especially when they're operating with limited resources, right? And I want to add another one to that. A lot of the startups do the mistake of hiring these big Rolodex guys from large companies. I have never seen that work. Talent which comes from A-level, A hitters, from other companies don't really perform well. So what is your advice? Because, our audience today is all startups.
Right. So look, I know I've had, in my past, I've had people from, top companies like Oracle.
Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
Yeah, so in the past, I've had people, from companies like Oracle and Microsoft join, have been hired into startups, right? Heavy hitters, multi-million-dollar quotas and everything else. I think what people don't appreciate is that in organizations that big, a salesperson has an incredible support network. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you have tons of sales engineers. You got, top of the line marketing, right? You got all the collaterals. You want to send an RFP, respond to an RFP. You got a team doing that, right? And they have, they got a set format, beautiful colored pictures, lots of case studies, blah, 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 blah. It's very easy sometimes to be effective there. And then if you're already selling sort of $100 million or $1 billion worth of software, making 10 on top of that is not too hard actually, right? So there is a sort of an ongoing volition momentum in those organizations that are already having a sales engine that's generating some sales, right? So if you become a part of that organization, well, even if you do a sort of a mediocre job, you sort of get the benefit of that acceleration and volition and momentum that is already ongoing. So you just a part of that whole process, right? Now, if you accelerate it from 1x to 2x and you're the head of sales, that's a different conversation. But if you're just a senior salesperson, there's a lot of that, and that's why you're seeing that 18-month wall, because it'll carry you for 18 months, and then somebody will say, hey, hold on a second, you're not actually adding to that momentum, right? And then you're out. So I think when you bring somebody from a large organization to a startup, I think they completely get sort of shell shocked that nothing is there, right? I mean, you're sort of starting greenfield, right? So if you come into as I have many times, coming into a startup situation, there's nothing there. I mean, nothing's there. I mean, there's no support, there's no marketing, there's no collateral. I mean, and what is there is just not available. So you got to roll up your sleeves and do a lot of that stuff yourself. You got to come up with a strategy. You got to figure out, hey, how do you take a small company and make it look like $1 million and act like $1 million and then treat customers like $1 million? All very hard to do.
Right.
And if you haven't got that in your experience, then it becomes even harder because you have no idea where to start.
Yeah.
Right?
So I've had that challenge, with a very dear friend of mine who works with one of our portfolio companies, and she's had that trouble. She said she actually thought that she was the assistant to the CEO, where she was asked to take notes in all the meetings. And she's a senior salesperson. She's worked at some of the large firms. So I've personally grappled with those kind of cultural issues. So I think it's just a factor of time where they kind of get adjusted to the fact and probably realize that someday their equity is going to be worth something, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. And of course, I mean, you obviously taking a significant cut in compensation
yes.
To do that, right? So it's always just got a catch-22 thing. So if you're a startup, how do you sort of get your sales engine up and running without actually, losing all your funds because you have a limited amount of funds? And I think the short answer is that if you have somebody, I mean, look for somebody who has innate sort of skills in communicating. And if you don't have it yourself, I think you should get it yourself as well. A lot of these things today is about actually listening and communicating, right? So sometimes you'll find somebody in your services area, like I used to be, or in your marketing area, right? Who generally loves talking to people and is approachable, listens really well, and then has enough of a technical background that they can understand or a curiosity to learn. I think you can groom them. Now, the ability to do that grooming has to sort of be there in the senior level management or on the board or on the on the VC side, right? To mentor somebody like that to sort of take that role on. Because at the end of the day, it's not a lot of rocket science. I think there are certain things in sales you can teach people, but if you don't have that innate sort of fundamental quality of actually liking people, liking to engage with people, liking to talk to people, the research aspect of it, learning customers' problems, coming up with solutions, and getting into the weeds of things. If you don't have those inclinations, you can't teach that. So one of the things you do need to do in your recruiting process in the sales is look for those things, as opposed to sort of I've kicked quota out of the ballpark. Is this someone you could sort of put in front of your best customer and they would feel, wow, what a nice person, they're listening to me, they're talking to me, they can communicate really well, both written and verbal. I think those are the things that you might want to start looking at a little bit more closely.
Right. So if you were you've done 2 CRO roles now currently at Beyond Passe and at WSO2.
Actually, one more, CAMS
also, yes. Sorry.
I was GM plus sales, yeah.
2 of them, and that's how I met you. You were clients of mine at both the places.
Right.
So the question is, how do you measure productivity of your sales guys, right? I mean, Anil Ramchandani from our audiences, has this very interesting question. Should you, considering we are moving to a 21st century playbook, which is all about, personal connects, not the pushy Glenn Glary, Glenn Ross kind of people,
right.
not your average car sales guy.
Right.
What kind of measurement criteria should you have? Or should you actually have that or not? Should you look at what is the average sales per B2B person? What those ratios? How do you measure effectiveness? Are those things important?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can't really run something without metrics, right? So I mean,
sure.
you got to have some basic idea around where people are going. But I think if you start sort of nickel and diming or getting down to the minutiae of how many calls you made and how many meetings you made, and you're not looking at a qualitative metrics about was that call a productive call, right? I mean, are you listening into the calls that some of your people are sitting in on, right? So I used to always pop in and sit on a call, right? One of the things that we did at WSO2 is on the first day, someone joined the sales team. we would pick a lead and put them on a call. They would just be like, I don't know anything about the product. Oh my God, right? Like, but you can have a conversation, right? We're right here. Have the call. So that, it's like, when you teach somebody how to swim, you take them to the deep end and you push them in, right? You teach them how to blow bubbles,
It's an
right?
interesting tactic though. Yeah.
Yeah. It was scary for the person, but the first thing they learn on the day one of their job is they lost that sort of fear that I need to like know everything to start a conversation. You really don't, right?
Yeah.
Because you can do the small courtesies, right? And then you can say, hey, look, I have this person right here that may be able to answer you. And this is even my first day at this job. You know what? That's a frank admission. People like that. Oh, wow, wonderful. Right. Congratulations, right? It breaks the ice down. So we would just get them to do that. And I think that would sort of help sort of, break the ice and get them to sort of start, getting into this role that, they're in the conversation mode, right? So I hope that sort of answered that question.
Yes, it did. It did. So, coming back to, 21st century playbook, right?
Right.
You have, always taken offense to the sales models, the classic hunter, using that kind of language, which is obnoxious and derogatory to some extent,
Yeah, but I always ask, if you're hunting, what does that make your customer? Prey, right? I mean, why would you set up that dichotomy? I mean, if you were the customer, would you like to be considered prey? I don't think so.
Right. So what are some of these, so-called irritants you have seen and you have corrected, because it's very important, because what happens, I'll tell you what happens. You observe this behavior, and then when you go to your new company, you take that behavior with you.
Yes.
And institutionalize it, right? And it's since the real estate days, right? I mean, forget the vacuum cleaner.
Yeah.
Tech wasn't even there in those industries. It really came from those industries, and it's permeated into the tech industry now.
Yeah.
Right. And we seem to be following the wrong playbook or the wrong nomenclature. Right. So there is one. Obviously, your customers are not your prey. Right. I mean, that's not the way to do account management or grow your sales. Right.
No.
So what are the other things which have cost? You've tried to change fully from a culture perspective.
So I mean, I know that some people have looked at things like on a SaaS model, for example, looked at how many people drop off after so many months, right? So,
right. Sure. Yes.
So they sold the wrong thing. Maybe after the sales process, we didn't make them loyal customers. So there's a process there, right? So that's one. And I think this the 21st century playbook is a lot about sort of understanding sort of the customer, like who the customer is and their life cycle, and just making sure that throughout that, it doesn't stop at close. So a lot of these sales playbooks are about closing, right?
Right.
Okay. So first of all, today, if you're on a recurring revenue model, right, closing is sort of a passe term, right? Because you want to renew, right? You want customers that stay on your platform forever. That's the customer you want. That's recurring revenue if you're a SaaS company, right? And which is what most software companies tend to be today. So if that's your sort of objective, then sort of closing is not that important. It's the process of going through. So we had this thing where we would divide that each account manager, whatever you call the salesperson was, that in addition to sort of getting new transactions and getting new customers, that they had to also nurture an existing book of customers. So there was not so handoff, like I sell and I'm gone and you never hear from me again, right? Because in the case of WSO2, it was a lot about recurring revenue, and they had to sort of renew the services that they were taking because they're an open source software company. So we had to make sure that salesperson stayed clued in to that customer throughout most of their life. And as we grew, we would add, we would get 20-30%. We would toggle that based on sort of the workload, but we would then give each person a new customer. Remember, now we're not driven by the compensation where the salesperson is saying, hey, I need new customers because I get paid bigger bucks if I'm doing new customers, right? So that compensation strategy is not working against us here, right? That doesn't exist. So when you say, look, you got to maintain your existing customers, make sure they're really happy, talk to them on a regular basis. If not for any business, how are they doing personally? What are they working on? What's happening in the company? Hey, heard about this. So you're tuned in to their customer. And then you have some new customers that you also take on based on your workload. And all of these customers renew. So now you have a long tail life cycle, right?
Right. So
I think in WSO2's case of 50 million, I think 44 million of that is recurring revenue.
Right.
I mean, come on. I mean, who would not love that number?
Right.
So you got to sort of build this model where you have sustained customer relationships. And if you're asking me about the pandemic, now more than ever, right? So when I joined WSO2, it was in 2008, 2009. That was after the meltdown of the financial crisis, right? Everything was looking really bleak, and we built that company up in the middle of a very bad global recession, also, right?
Right.
So there are some things that never change, and that's the fact that if you look at your customer as a long-term partnership or engagement with somebody, a long-term relationship, then you don't take these short-term sort of thinking actions behind it.
Yeah. So let me give you a hypothetical scenario on that, which kind of assimilates a lot of the advice you've been giving. You're selling some advisory work to a tech startup, pre-revenue tech startup or early revenue tech startup.
Right.
You've suddenly sold 100,000 client to a gullible client. Obviously, the client did not realize it. It's a recurring revenue deal. It's not going to get renewed. The guy hit his numbers, went to the president's club, and now the client is not renewing. The person has gone and left the company. New salesperson has come, and now he's trying to get the client back.
Right.
And obviously, the client is not going to sign up. Right. This kind of behavior permeates, and you and I've seen that happen all the time in sales. Right. I mean, I've led teams in sales who have been guilty of doing those kind of things. So how do you arrest this kind of behavior?
Look, I don't know how the resting is a hard part. I mean, I think you're nipping in the bud and really, make sure. I think it's important that, if you think of sales as a team sport, right, and you do sort of enough oversight, you will also, there'll be more than one person interfacing with the customer. I always believe that's the case, right? So you always have a two-tiered system. So, the chances of that happening unless it's collusion of two people, reduces the risk by 50%, right? So you got to make sure that multiple people are engaging and doing handoffs and talking to the customer. I used to do that. I mean, really, there's no clean way to clear that up. So I give you two examples of what happened to me. I remember once was that we had a multi-million-dollar account at this company called OneSoft, e-commerce company, and we halfway through, just 3 months before we went live. The engineering team came and said, "Oh, by the way, we've just realized that it doesn't scale to the numbers that you guys want to grow, and you have to upgrade the product to the new version." And I was like, "My God, I mean, that's crazy. I mean, we're just 3 months away from going live. Now we got to redo everything on the services side for the new version." So it was sort of a all hands sort of meeting internally, and I remember the conversation going that, "Hey, we'll just tell the customer." I mean, one of the decisions that they were trying, or options they were trying, was, "Hey, aren't there a lot of changes they have requested? Can you just tell them that you have to push it back 6 months from the date because they've requested all these changes, and blame it on them, and then we'll sort of surreptitiously upgrade the software?" I said, "Look, I'm sorry, you want me to do that? I will resign. I will not do that to a customer. I will not, right? I will not lie. That customer is I have a relationship with them that will go on in the future as well, not only now. I will not do that. I will not lie to the customer." So then they said, "What are we going to do? Because, what do you study?" I said, "Leave it with me. I'll handle it." So I called up the customer. I was in Virginia, Washington, D.C. I went, called them up in West Palm Beach, the head, the vice president, and I said, "I need to talk to you. It is a little serious. I can fly down tomorrow if you want, or you can fly up, whatever you prefer, and I don't want to discuss it over the phone." So she said, "I'll fly up." So she flew up. I went, picked her up from the airport, took her for lunch. And I said, "Look, here's the problem. Here's what's happened, right? We can't go live with this version of the software, right? Normally, you would, if you were getting this version in the future, you would have to pay for the upgrade. These are the old days of perpetual licensing. But I say, here's what I'm willing to do. If you can convince your board to push the thing for 6 months, I will upgrade for free, and I will take 20% of the change orders I have pushed for Passe go live for the next phase, and I'll incorporate it today at no charge. But you need to buy 6 months on the board, right?" So we negotiated that, and she appreciated my candor. She went back to the board, right, and told them the sort of the bad news, but told them the good news. The good news is they were getting a free version upgrade. Their site was going to be better, but it was going to be delayed by 6 months, right? I mean, that was the only way to do that. I mean, we remain friends to this day, and it was a successful launch, right? But how else would you do something like that, right? I mean, you have to make those tough decisions, right? And that's the only way to do that. I mean, you have to be honest.
Yeah.
Clients will trust you. They'll be upset. They'll scream at you. They'll do all those things. But at the end of the day, they will remember that you didn't screw them.
Yeah, I think most sales guys don't realize that, the buying segment, whether it's CEOs or other CXOs, that remains fairly perpetual. They move, they'll take, they'll buy from you. You move, and if you screwed with them, they'll remember that. They'll never buy again from you, right?
Yeah.
So in the short term, yeah. So Anil again has a very interesting connect. He said if sales guys are going to be measured predominantly on their EQ, okay, or their ability to connect with customers.
Mm-hmm.
What does it do in terms of the salesperson trying to target the customer, right? How does some of those things change? The ability to close deals and always being on the number and just not dilly-dallying.
Yeah. So I mean,
how do you balance that? It's a fair question, right?
Yeah, it's a fair point. A good question, Ajay. I mean, I think I have found that when you do all the other fundamental things right, and yes, and you have to have smarts. I mean, you have to discern a tire kicker from a car buyer, right? Essentially, someone who kicks the tires around, who may be wasting your time, who may not have authority to buy, right? They're just interested in sort of this tango that they're doing, right? And negotiating maybe because the final decision is actually made by the CEO, and they feel that they're adding value if they sort of knock you down on price. Like all of these things happen, right? I'm not disagreeing with that. If you've been around in sales long enough, you've seen all the games that people play. Understood. However, I think that if you have the smarts to sort of discern that early enough, right? I mean, you have to have a sort of a nose for that, and you can also train people to sort of figure that out, right? And then based on that, and there's some sort of qualifying sort of techniques and things like that that may be from the 20th century playbook, but they can be refined to the 21st century playbook that you can use to say, weed out the wheat from the chaff kind of thing. But once sort of that's done, I think if you sort of lay out a nice 100% well, you're still 50% of the deal, right? Because the other 50% is the customer, right? So even if you're 100% accurate and done a fabulous job, you're still 50%, right? And that's why this is such a hard job.
Yes.
Right? So at the very best you can do is 50%, and I don't know anyone, myself included, that ever got to 50. Right. So yes. So you have to sort of make sure that process is facilitated very well. But at the end of the day, the customer can still walk, can still say, "I give you no idea, no explanation, just walk." Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's an occupational hazard in this business. Right.
Sure.
But if you have enough of them lined up, then that you account for for a few just unexplainably just disappearing. Everyone's got that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are coming up to the hour, Labi. 5 more minutes. Do you want to, on our request, you want to summarize the 21st century sales playbook? Any parting thoughts, for the audience? They're all early stage startups. They're trying to, grow their revenue. I do want to make a comment on the, the point you talked about, the tire kicker versus the car buyer, right? I mean, when I ran sales, my VP of sales, told me very clearly, the first question you need to go and ask is, why should I talk to you? Do you have the ability to buy? I used to find that really rude, but over a period of time, I started appreciating that. We have a retail tech analytics company, and I was talking to the founder there in 100 Watts, and she's been trying to work on a client, and the client seems to be slippery as an eel, right? And that we just started ignoring the customer, eventually, and he said we need to move on.
Yeah. And
that's not easy because you have that forecasted. Your boss is asking you when is that going to close, and you suddenly have put it at 75% chance of closure in your Salesforce system, right? But you realize it's only 50% even at 100%.
Yeah. So I mean, band qualification, budget, authority, need, timeline is critical, right? So at the process, you have to qualify whether the person has the budget, authority, and authority sometimes is very sort of a slippery thing to understand, right? Culturally, there are certain nuances. So I noticed, and I learned this early in my career when I was living in Sri Lanka, trying to sell to India. I mean, I thought I was dealing with all the SVP types and EVPs and all that in this company. And, I was all the way, I spent 3 months on that transaction. And then at the very end, when it came time to sort of actually anting up and contracting, they said, oh, we have to talk to our CEO. I said, and then you have to bring them up to speed. I'm like, I'm sorry. And I walked away. And I knew I'd wasted 3 months, right? Because I realized that even they may have the title, they don't have the authority to buy a paperclip.
Yeah, true.
Right. So somehow you got to find out whether the organizational culture to understand, does this person have the authority even to buy a paperclip? Because if they're trying to buy something that's $500,000, you better bet that if you're not talking to the CEO, maybe culturally speaking, of the culture of the company, you will probably never get a deal, right? So you have to make
how
sure
do you do that? I mean, a very practical question. You go into a prospect meeting, you can't ask them very bluntly, right? I mean, you can ask everything else except for authority.
Yeah. No, the thing is, I think you have to sort of, I think rapport and building a relationship is very key. Right? So yeah. So what you do is you explore, hey, what other technology have you bought? What was the process in that first? How did that go?
That's a good way to ask. Yes. What's the last thing you bought?
You're asking them, how did that process work? Look, I'm new. I'm dealing with your company for the first time. Tell me what the steps are. How do I know, how this is going to go? What do I need to do? So I know, and I need to let my team know that this is how this is going to work, right? Tell me the story. What's the narrative, right? We do this. Okay, great. Then you do that, you do this. Okay, then what happens, right? So if you know that, if you just go blind, I think a lot of people just go to a call and say, wow, that was an awesome call. We got it, 75%, right? That's a mistake.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts on the 21st century playbook? Just to recap, the main things, for our.
I was thinking of your audience, the startups, right? So, I mean, a lot of companies, I mean, I've seen this, a lot of people say, hey, look, I grew to 10 million without sales, right? And they wear that like a badge of honor, right? So I've always asked this question on LinkedIn from a number of people. If you had somebody in sales, what do you think that number would have been, right? So yeah, it's not saying that you can't grow organically, right? I mean, some people can, network, friends and family. And by the way, this business also still relies on a lot of luck, right? So if you're lucky, yeah, it may happen, and you shouldn't discount luck. It may happen that you're successful, right? But my question is, you can bootstrap yourself and do this sort of, the hard way. You can reach 10 million, but what if you had actually then hired a founder with a sales experience or marketing experience and made that investment early? Would you have been a $50 million company, $100 million company? Right? You wouldn't know, right? So I think there's a lot of this sort of self-congratulations and people patting themselves on the back saying, hey, I made it on my own. I'm, 5 years struggle and I'm at 5 million and, I have no debt, I have no that. Great, but then you're still a $5 million company 5 years later. Could you have been a $50 million company? And you'll be having a very different set of options open to you. And I think that's the question you can ask. So I think the advice for a startup I would give in the 21st century is, first, if you're a startup founder who has a technical bent, learn the basics of sales. I mean, there's plenty of stuff out there now. And Bhavish can say, I think, send me questions. I'm happy to always mentor people with answering a few questions. So if you want to do that, you can. But bounce ideas off of people who've been in the business a little bit. What do I need to do? And it's critical, I think, that you don't build a product in isolation or a service in isolation. I think you need to sort of think about the person buying it from day one, right? And then you also have to think about how that person that's supposed to buy it, how are you going to actually get to that person? Because your build will be influenced by the buy. I think people forget that sometimes, right? So if you are going to sell to a particular audience and a specific niche, then what is the problem that you're solving in that audience, and how do we make the build fit that particular category, right? That's product market fit, as Bhavish would always say, and positioning. You got to start thinking of this from day one, right? So it's not only about I build it all and then I'll hire a salesperson and then say, hey, I got this product. Now can you sell it to all these people, right? I think you got to, as early as possible when it makes sense, and then earlier the better, you get the salesperson engaged so that they understand what is it you're building, who are you going to target, why you're building this product the way you're building, or the service you're structuring. I think all of that is very important. And if you do that, and then you sort of hire, forget all this sort of compensating people, just look for those people that in your daily interactions. And who was my server in a restaurant, okay, in the US. And Vaneta, and she was from Estonia. She was a fabulous waitress, right? Every time we went to this restaurant, I was blown away by the level of service and how she interacted with me and any guest that I brought. And I hired her. She was a great salesperson. She had never sold anything in her life, okay? But the thing is, she had those fundamentals. I realized that. So if you are an entrepreneur or a startup, keep your eyes open. Look for those people. And it doesn't have to be in your industry, right? That
Right.
you feel builds relationships easily with anybody, with strangers, right? The technology stuff, if they have a passion for learning, you can teach them. So sometimes maybe you hire that person and not somebody from Oracle who's got supposedly a big Rolodex, because I've never seen somebody with big Rolodex actually sell to that Rolodex.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. Because they probably have missold to them trying to make up for their quota, right?
No. If you already bought something, why would you buy another thing, right? I mean, you've already sort of cemented the relationship, right? So I mean, you don't buy middleware like you change your underwear every day, right? So it's not like you're, if it's a consumer product, maybe, but again, that company's done a pretty good job after you sold it to make sure they have a good relationship with you, with the company, irrespective of whether the salesperson's there or not. So you got to factor that in.
Lavi, it's been lovely talking to you today. We are over time, but I want to end with a comment which Saket has written on. He said, next session should be on how to sell yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean that's important. I mean, as a salesperson, as a company, I mean, how to sell yourself or your company, I think it's a very important session. Yeah.
Yes. Great, Lavi. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure hosting you.
Thank you, Bhavish. Thank you, Ajay.
Till next time. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.